everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where writers sit around, drink tasty beverages, and talk about writing, editing, publishing, and the whole creative process. There will be rants and raves and opinions that may not agree, but are lovingly delivered. We do not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Today's gallery include Chaz and Karen Brenchley, and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 164, an interview with Jo Fletcher. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Well, we are so glad to have you. Ever since starting to correspond with you on Twitter, and, well, you've known Chaz just forever, right?
Oh, yes. We go way back to the glory days of the 1980s when we were young and beautiful and in our prime. And now we're not quite so young, but every bit as beautiful and certainly still in our prime.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, we are certainly pretty. We are not going to say, and it's some jerk pointed out that the 80s were 40 years ago, and then he had to get up off the floor because I punched him. That is very rude to say to a woman who hasn't had any coffee yet in the morning.
Even worse to say without gin in her hand. Exactly.
So you are, I believe right now, a freelance Freebird editor for hire, a pen and eraser and red marker for hire. Is that what you're correct for what you're doing these days? How do you describe yourself?
It is. As of a month ago, I've returned to whence I started, which is a bit strange. I've been editing, publishing for my own imprint, Jo Fletcher Books, for the past nearly 12 years. And the powers that be decided it was time for me to move on. So I am returning to actually what I really love, which is getting down and dirty with manuscripts, helping authors to be the very best they can, and getting rid of every single time they use seam when they didn't mean seam.
Okay, that's going to take some unpacking. What do you mean? It seems like you're trying to say something here.
No, I don't seem like I am trying to say it. Every author has tics. Every author has things they do that they don't realize they're doing it, because it's like shaking and nodding of heads, you know? We do it all the time when we're talking. I bet Chaz and Karen, if you're looking at each other now, I bet you're nodding along, aren't you?
Oh, hell yeah.
So it seems natural to put that in the book, but before you realize it, you've got pages and pages and pages of nodding and shaking of heads and shrugging and lifting of eyebrows. So one of the things I really enjoy is just exercising all of that and saving you from your own self.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I used to say the word silently far too much, and then I did a search on a document and discovered that I'd said silently like 400 times. Oh dear.
Everyone has something. Everyone has something.
I believe it. So one of it is people, especially in their real life, if they say just over and over again, can I just talk to you for a minute? Can we just... And then you realize that just is one of the biggest lies. Like, can you just look at this a little and take a minute, which is a dirty, dirty lie every time anybody says it, right?
Absolutely. And I had a wonderful publicist, and she'd just joined me, and we went out to lunch, and I could not stop myself, and I'm so embarrassed about this, but I could not stop myself from saying, you use like twice in every sentence.
Was she from California?
She was not. She was English, British. Although she had she lived on the continent as well. But it's a thing these days. It's what young people grow up saying. Like, like I was just going down to the shops, like, and I thought I'd buy this book, like, and my friend, like, well, she said it was really cool, like, so I thought, like, I'd give it a go.
It did sound like California too, so clearly it happens in both places. So here's a question. How is the difference between using it there and then, as you were using the word like over and over again, I was remembering that Neil Gaiman has written a lot of poetry, and he uses the word like very frequently. The rain came down like suicides.
Yeah, it's used with intent.
Yes.
If you're using it with intent, I have no problem at all. If you are using repetition with intent, absolutely brilliant. You have to know that you are doing it. And most of the time you don't, and you don't mean to use the same words over and over. I do sometimes when it's quite bad, I do say to my beloved authors, go on, just highlight this word, see how many times you use it. And then you get the embarrassed call and the offer of more gin, and we're all happy again.
That's beautiful. So where do you fall in on the use the word said versus murmured, tilting her head to the side?
On the whole, said is an extremely useful word because you don't see it when you're reading. It's just there to tag a sentence. Quite often you don't need anything at all. The biggest problem comes when you feel that every sentence needs to be tagged with something, she said, a little sadly. Why is that? He sighed. Well, she murmured, her voice going lower, because that's not really right. He grunted. Do you think so? His voice was rough now.
I think we've all read that book.
Now you can see, all you can see are the tags, not what they're actually saying. Although in that case, they weren't saying anything of importance anyway. So I'd get rid of the whole paragraph. But you want people to concentrate on the words that matter. And a lot of the time, especially adverbs, should be banished for all time.
I was just going to ask you what your stance was on adverbs.
I don't loathe them as much as some people.
She said slowly.
And
Can't help it, I'm sorry.
I don't loathe them as much as some people, but I do think you have to be careful when you're using them.
Judiciously.
You have to be judicious about using them.
Ooh, she got you there.
She did.
A veritable touch. Can I throw a pet peeve out there and tell me if you see it all the time?
Oh, go ahead.
I contemplate that I can sit and talk to Karen and Chaz for hours in their living room, sipping whatever tasty beverage they happen to be serving. And I don't usually say, now, as you know, Karen, or I don't actually use their names in full thread of conversation unless I'm trying to get somebody's attention. For instance, Chaz, you're about to drop your wine. Or, the cat. It's a very direct attention grabbing thing. But I see it so often in the first opening, like I say, opening 3 chapters and even later through the book. We're in a romantic scene. Maybe we are murmuring together in the moonlight. I don't recall ever using somebody's name in that situation in real life. And so it definitely throws me in a book. What do you say to people when they're constantly saying, as you know, Chaz, and well, Chaz?
I take it out. If they don't know who they're talking with, we've got a much bigger problem.
Exactly.
I absolutely agree. I completely agree with you. I think writers, especially starting writers, are scared to let the reader do too much work. And they need to have faith, because our beloved readers are just as clever as we are. And if they're invested in the book, they're following who said what. It's interesting. One of the things that not being a publisher anymore has freed me to do is to read outside my my normal submission pile. And I picked up a copy, beautiful Barnes & Noble copy of The Swiss Family Robinson, the presentation copy they did, illustrated by Heath Robinson. Absolutely gorgeous book, which I have not read since I was a child. And I think there's a very strong chance that when I read it, it was abridged. So I started reading this a couple of nights ago, and I realised, apart from the fact that the pastor is the most sanctimonious git you could ever hope to meet in a book, I don't think many children would find it a very easy book to read these days. Have you read it?
I
have, but again, not since childhood.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not that any of the words are difficult, because they're not, but the style of writing, it's a 19th century novel, And it's about a family who rock up on this island and make a life for themselves. And there are no speech marks. It's mostly the father narrating, telling the children to stop being selfish and start to think of themselves and their good provider, and generally lectures them and ensures their moral and philosophical well-being is well looked after while they're off killing any animal they happen to come across.
Yes.
Because obviously they need to eat. But it's interesting that although there are no speech marks, paragraphing is virtually unknown to the author, but it's not hard to read because the sentences, although long, are actually quite well constructed.
So how do you see the stylistic change between I call the long sentence version is almost the Jane Austen syndrome versus the Raymond Chandler, if it has more than 10 words, I'm surprised?
It must have something to do with shorter attention spans. It must have something to do with television and radio. It must have something to do with the way children are taught, although I'm not a teacher and it's been some years since I was at school, so I'm not going to go down that route. But whatever it is, people find it difficult to get immersed in a book which requires real effort in reading it, I think. And it's a shame because I read, again, going through some of the old Victorian favourites, and I can't help but think, if they were published now, would they be the multi-million bestsellers that they are?
Well, that's a good point. When I was in the 3rd and 4th grade, my favorite novel was Oliver Twist, and I read it many times. And then I read it again as an adult, and it was a different book. And so I can see what you mean. And as a child, I would read anything. I mean, obviously, I would read, but that didn't mean I understood well above my grade level. But I could still get through the basic story. But yes, I understand what you mean, because I read Robinson Crusoe, and my memory of it is stuff happened, but I have no sense of any of the people in it. Okay. Whereas Oliver Twist, I have a very good sense of Fagin and Oliver and some of the other characters, because Dickens was much better than this guy.
I think it's different. I mean, when we were kids, that was the Madeline L'Ongle, Beverly Cleary age in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And your chateaus. And so and yet there's some of us that my grandmother was getting her English degree when I was learning how to read. So one of my early pieces that I got was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is stunningly fantastic for children.
Yes.
Go out and read it too, because it is exactly the same as Sam I Am. I am Sam, Sam I am. I am Enkidu am I. They're very repetitious that way, but I also had a house full of Clavel and Michener, so that was my 3rd grade reading. So I got great sex education based on novelists early.
I think we all did, didn't we? I remember someone gave me a copy of The Virgin Soldiers for my 7th birthday, I think. And we weren't allowed, I grew up in a pacifist family, and so we weren't allowed war books, and it had to be snuck in under. But everyone was, it was the book going around school. I wanted to read it. The Godfather and all those books. Yeah, no one thought about, or we certainly didn't think about ages the way I think people do now.
Yeah, when I was a kid, there were 2 sections in the library. There was the children's section and the adult section, and you migrated from one to the other when you were 12, I think. This whole notion of these are middle grade books and these are YA and da 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 da. That's I don't know. I find it so limiting.
Do you feel it does a disservice to the kids to say, right, you should never include a word that they don't understand? Or
yeah,
absolutely.
Should we remember The Princess Bride, where she said, it was a syllabub. He knew a syllabub was a drink with tea and jam, but he also knew an apology when he heard one. That it explains the words that get used.
I became a young adult when the young adult library, young adult books became a thing. And And so the local library, because I was there all the time, said, here, be on our young adult panel, and help us pick young adult books. And I found that really fascinating because, again, I suddenly started reading more sex than I ever had before. And this was a very Mormon area where I grew up. And so they were concerned about these things. But yeah, I learned an awful lot about that kind of thing. And so it was very helpful. So in one sense, it's nice to be able to steer people of a certain age to certain books because, it gives expands their knowledge because I think there's far more sex in YA than I've ever read in adult novels. Mm-hmm. But that might just be me.
Was it just an excuse for you to get free books?
Don't ask her the questions that we don't want to, I always found it interesting that in all of them, there's such a big deal about, their actual sexuality, and thinking the first ones where they ever had a book talk about having a period was earth-shattering to me and fantastic because, I'd had miserable, horrible periods starting, 10 years old. And as they talk about, I actually kind of enjoy that finally, we're starting to have periods in fantasy novels. I'm just saying that, okay, a girl gets on horseback and rides for, 3 months across the steppes. Somewhere in there, she's going to bleed. It's just the way life's work.
Exactly. There wasn't YA when I was growing up. I think the first time I came across coming of age issues was probably I lucked into a pile of Judy Blume books.
Yes.
As an adult, but I hadn't read her. I'd heard great things about her, so I might possibly have lifted the lot of them and worked my way through them. And I was in awe of a woman who could write so brilliantly about things that at that age I wouldn't have known I needed to know, but most definitely did.
Yes, she was one of the ones that I was frequently called in for the young adult panel because a parent complained about it, about one of her books.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Because, they had sex in them. And this was, Pocatello, Idaho, who is, 2 hours drive north of Utah. So
I'm going out on a limb that people in Utah have sex. Just a theory.
They don't read about it.
And they don't want their children to know about it.
But this brings up an interesting question, and let me back up to make it a more 20,000 view question. Jo, you've been editing for a long time, and we've talked about kind of how the styles have changed. What trends are you seeing now?
Well, we're talking about YA, and that is the biggest trend I'm seeing. There's a lot more romantasy out there than there has been for some years. There is a lot less hard SF out there, which is a shame. My list, I've always, wherever I've worked, endeavored to make it as broad a church as possible, because the whole point of this genre in which we play is it can be anything. It can be crime, it can be romance, it can be hard, it can be soft, it can be historical, it can be alternate worlds. I always describe it, and it gets boring, but we are Ginger Rogers. We do everything that a fiction novelist does, but we do it backwards and on high heels, because we have to get the world perfect before we put in our characters and our plots. And that's why I've always stayed within this field, although we read absolutely voraciously outside it. Nonetheless, to work in it, I can do anything I want. And every time a big trend comes along, an all-encompassing trend, what I see is the mainstream publishers focusing on that to the detriment of everything else. And that, thank heavens, is when the small presses and indies pick up the slack until publishers come to their senses again.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what I'm loving at the moment, Jo, is the resurgence in clean, pure space opera, because it's always been my favorite subgenre of science fiction. And there's so much good stuff around at the moment.
I started JFB in 2011, and it took me, 8 years to find a decent space opera. And now we're getting loads of them again, and it's really exciting. And all sorts, not just Star Wars revisited, but really interesting things.
I also froze solid when you said the word romantasy and thought that was the best word I've ever heard. And how have I only heard that today?
I've not come across that, and I love it.
Romantasy.
Yes.
I mean, to a certain extent, from when I had a roommate years ago in college that loved bodice rippers, and she had a pile of them literal beside her bed. And so I was reading them, and to me, it's like, well, they're all kind of fantasy, aren't they? But the romantasy in terms of I love all of the Zoe Chant and all of the spin-offs of the shapeshifter romance, and my favorite is somebody actually went out and wrote shape-shifting honey badger thrillers with a touch of romance that are just freakishly beautiful. All the explosions, all of the bullets, all of the violence. And yeah, technically it's shapeshifter romances, but let's talk about violence.
See, space for everything.
There is space for everything. Do you see, I mean, I know they say you can't write for a trend coming up, but what are some of the big ones that are going right now that are just, that automatically you'll say, okay, yeah, I'd look at that just because it's a popular genre?
Well, witches are big again. They haven't been for a long time. They're certainly coming back. I'm seeing, I said when I finished publishing Charlene Harris's Sookie Stackhouse series that I would never publish another vampire book because there were a lot of them. And by that time, everyone was doing vampires. And then a couple of years ago, my then assistant, who's now running Hodder's new SF imprint, Hodderscape. I will give a shout out to Molly Powell because she's brilliant. But she came to me and said, Jo, I found this vampire novel on the slush pile, and I don't want you to read it. I don't want you to publish it. But if you can just tell me what I ought to suggest he does next. And I started reading it, and I got really mad because I had no choice but to publish it. It was that good. And Lee Herman wrote a sequel to the first one, and it was about a lesbian vampire who falls in love with a girl who suffers panic attacks and has real problems going out. And it's clever, and it's funny, and it's romantic, and it's scary. And damn it, there I was publishing vampire books again.
Hang on, what was the title?
Oh, Love Bites.
Okay.
I've seen that one. Well, here's something that you just brought up, something that I had noticed recently. I have seen a lot more neurodivergence in book characters. And I kind of like it because it sort of existed if you sit with your armchair psychology degree and you look at the different characters within some of the historical, air quote, classic literature, like, yeah, what is wrong with you? Let's talk about the Brontes and their characters.
Absolutely.
But now I love that a lot of the characters, especially when they're first person narrated, you get to see all of the brain weasels right up front. And I think sometimes it makes it easy for people to relate to them because there are so many brain weasels across the planet, but seeing them in action in your hero and heroines can make them very relatable. And I've seen more of that. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. We're all on the spectrum somewhere, let's face it. I have an author who wrote 2 wonderful books, then took 10 years off because she had an autistic son and devoted a lot of time to bringing him up. This is Kit Whitfield. And when when her agent sent me her book, I loved that all of that, everything she'd learnt over those 10 years, everything that she'd discovered about her son and about how his brain worked and what did work and what didn't work is all funneled into the character of a young boy who is believed to have been touched by the kind neighbors, the fairies, the uncanny who live in the woods next door. And this is why he can't go inside. This is why he screams if you touch him. This is why he will only converse in grunts and snorts, but with his family. But they can help him to do a day's work. He's very loving to them, but he is not normal. And the heart of this story is the fairy smiths having to help him, or rather having to stop the local bigwigs hanging him for poaching in the forest because he doesn't know any better. And as I was reading it, I just kept thinking that explains so much. All those books about fairies I read back in the day, and about people touched by the fae and how people reacted, and suddenly here is someone laying it out for me. I thought it was absolutely wonderful.
That's clever.
That sounds really good, yes.
And again, the title?
The book is Kit Whitfield's In the Heart of Hidden Things, and it came out, earlier this year. Chaz, if you get hold of it, I hope you love it.
It reminds me of Elizabeth Moon's Speed of Dark was one of the first ones that I read using a point of view of an autistic person. And wow.
That was an amazing book. I love that one.
So what advice would you give as you've seen everybody's foibles and failures, and there's a cartoon that I'm probably going to post and saying, don't worry, my editor will clean it up. What advice would you give to somebody who's, okay, they're interested in becoming a published author? Maybe they've written a few stories, or maybe they've written a first draft of a novel. What would you advise?
I would say never, ever send it out until you have put it under your bed and sat on it for 2 months and then gone through it again when you've forgotten everything you wrote, or at least given it a chance. I would say never rely on spell check. I think it is really important that you check it yourself. I would say look for the repetitions that you know are going to be there, even if you don't recognize them straight off. And I would say don't be afraid to let your readers do some of the work.
That's lovely.
Yeah,
I'm having so much fun at the moment. I'm going through a series that I wrote like 25 years ago for a new edition. And I was just obsessed with semicolons and ellipses. I'm taking out so many of them. It's extraordinary.
How wonderful you get to do that, though.
I know.
Honestly, that's a really exciting thing. Because you've grown as an author, you've grown as a stylist. I think that's a smashing thing to be able to do.
Yeah, it really is. I'm just delighted about the whole thing.
So what is this series and who's publishing it, by the way?
They are the Books of Outremer, my Crusader fantasy. They're being published by Wizard's Tower Press.
And are any out so far?
Yeah, the first two are out, and I'm working through the third as we speak.
I'm sorry, I've got to ask him. I got to ask these kind of questions of him, because otherwise he'll never admit that he's got anything actually out. So
I love those books. I really do. Crusader fantasy. What's not to love?
That was my own thought when the idea struck me. It was lovely.
The Hound and the Falcon trilogy by Judy Tarr, still some of my favorite Crusader fantasies.
Oh, yeah. She's good. She's good. She went to Mount Holyoke too.
Exactly. So, Jo, if somebody wanted to say, right, I need you to take a look at me, I think this woman can help me be better, should they just email you directly? Should they reach out on the Facebook page? How would somebody engage with somebody like you to make them better?
I think reaching out on Facebook, just messaging me on Facebook right now, is the easiest way to get through to me. I'm only just settling into this. I'm trying to work out how my days are going to run. I've got 2 or 3 things to finish for my JFB authors, and then once that's done in the new year, I'm getting on with rebuilding my freelancing life.
Magnificent. Well, we will put a link to your Facebook page and maybe an email, as well as all the other topics we mentioned during this podcast on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. Thank you so much, Jo. This has been terribly fun.
It's gone so fast.
I know, right? Well, we may have to have you back to talk about more specific questions as they come up in terms of editing. So out there, if you have questions that you would want to ask Jo, go ahead and send them to us or put it on our website. And maybe even we could convince Jo to have a blog corner that she talks about. These are the top 5 things I think you should avoid, or boy, do I wish there was more of this out there in the publishing world.
Oh, that'd be so much fun, wouldn't it?
We'll see what we can do.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always up for drinking coffee with writers.
It's been a delight. You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spiders are David Welsh and John Schmidt. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with a Morning Person, both by Michael Langberg. Our podcast sponsors are Jackal Designs, Arm Street in Ukraine, and honorable mention to all of the beautiful coffee streets on Murphy Street. And hey, thanks for listening.